Are we witnessing a return to the age of imperialism? Are Russia's annexations of Ukraine just the tip of the iceberg? And how does this affect Taiwan? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Yen Chen-shen, Professor of US-Taiwan Relations at National Chengchi University, and Albert Cho, Professor of Donghai University's Department of Political Science. And earlier I spoke to Oleksandr Merezhko, Ukrainian Member of Parliament and Chair of the Ukraine-Taiwan Friendship Group in Ukraine's Rada, speaking to me from Kyiv, and Mathieu Droin, a visiting fellow at CSIS's Europe, Russia and Eurasia Program, focusing on transatlantic security and defense, speaking to me from Washington, D.C. France and Germany have called Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine evidence of Russian imperialism. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron were addressing September's UN General Assembly.
Russlands Eroberungskrieg gegen die Ukraine ist durch nichts zu rechtfertigen. Präsident Putin führt ihn mit einem einzigen Ziel, sich der Ukraine zu bemächtigen. Selbstbestimmung und politische Unabhängigkeit zählen für ihn nicht. Dafür gibt es nur ein Wort. Das ist blanker Imperialismus.
Il est une chose sûre et certaine. Au moment où je vous parle, il y a des troupes russes en Ukraine. Et à ma connaissance, il n'y a pas de troupes ukrainiennes en Russie. C'est un état de fait. Ce à quoi nous assistons depuis le 24 février dernier est un retour à l'âge des impérialismes et des colonies. La France le refuse.
Albert Cho, if I can start with you.
Sure.
So Scholz defines this as imperialism. Macron says this is the return of the age of imperialism. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, in general, I agree. The definition of imperialism is actually the policy of extending influence of power through military means or other kind of political approaches, right? So we are seeing this is happening in Russia, in China, even in North Korea. And, you know, speaking of that, we, as a Taiwanese, we are experiencing a lot of pressure from China and, you know, too many Chinese nationalists, those who believe in Chinese nationalism can you know, bring China back to the world stage. They would love to embrace and serve to China. So I think this is the start of that kind of imperialism that we see in the 21st century, and we should be careful about that.
Yen Chen-shen, is this the imperialism of the 21st century, as Albert said?
Okay, of course, the imperialism we are familiar with are the, you know, in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, including especially colonialism. So this is ironic here. Imperialism used to be what Russian or Soviet leader Lenin accused of Western countries, saying their capitalism reached a stage that they have to compromise with their domestic workers so that they cannot exploit their own lower class anymore. So they went out to exploit the third world country, you know, the backward area, so that they can compensate for their loss at home. So that was saying, you know, imperialism was the last stage of capitalism. But today we are looking at Russia, saying this is a form of imperialism. I look at the speech, Scholz mentioned one time, Macron mentioned 4 times. But if you look at Macron's argument, he's saying this is a different kind of imperialism because it involves the country using food security, using energy security, using nuclear security, and even using, we call, the movement of people, as well as, you know, the diplomatic methods. So it's totally different, I would say, from the previous one. When we talk about imperialism, we can go all the way back even to Roman Empire or you know, any kind of empire that's imperial, or China in its history, we call imperial China, right? Dynastic China. So it's quite different. But
why do you think that they use this term imperialism?
I have difficult time understanding Macron because for him, he should first apologize for French colonialism in Africa, right? Okay, yes, you granted independence in 1960, but you also have one, which one you didn't want to let it go. That's Algeria. They fought a very bloody independence war, right? Because Traditionally, France say this is so close to us, we like it. So in a way, Algeria is almost like Ukraine to Russia, Algeria to France, and it just won't let it go. And also, if you look at Russia, okay, during the Soviet time, yes, that's imperialism. They continue to expand. But just like every big empire, you will have minorities. And then once you have breakup of the empire, you find all these different people are in one country. And that would cause a lot of problems. I have been to Central Asia, been countries like Ukraine, Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan. And I asked local people, like, are you mad with the Russians? They said, you know, there are still some Russians there, but those Russians are, we call the less well-to-do people. If you are capable, you are a higher class government bureaucrat, you already left. You know, the Central Asian countries. Those who have no means, they stay. So they have less problem with that. But Ukraine is a little bit different. It's not, again, it's not Muslim like Central Asia. Ethnically, they are closer to Russian. So Russia always felt that this is a dear one, that is different. But I think the biggest problem was the 2014, when Obama did sit on the sideline and didn't do anything at the time. And so it is almost like people saying Hitler during World War II. Okay, Hitler said, I need breathing space, right? You know, breathing room, living space. So what happened is, if you allow Hitler to gain Czechoslovakia, that's part of, you know, the German area of Czechoslovakia. Eventually, they also took Austria. You know, it's also German speaking. And then you said, is that going to satisfy him? No, he went to Poland later, right?
So Albert Cho, very good point that Yen Chen-shen raised there. So understanding this imperialism then makes you understand, I guess, the trend and the momentum. What else, why else do you believe that, as Yen Chen-shen said, Macron mentioned it 4 times, what do you think was behind him saying a return to the age of imperialism?
Well, I sort of want to add up to Professor Yen's point in that I don't see any contradiction between, say, if you will, accusing France as a imperial, you know, in Africa, versus accusing Russia as an imperial against Ukraine. I don't see there's a necessary logical inconsistency between the 2 cases. I think both of them are just in different historical stages. Okay, that's number one I would like to emphasize. And the second is that because we are living in the 21st century, and the real situation we are in is such that there is a aggression or even military operation, you know, according to Putin's phrase in Russia, and even there's a possibility that China is likely to attack Taiwan. For whatever reason you think is legitimate or illegitimate. And there's likelihood out there. And if that really occurs, and a lot of people will sacrifice, a lot of people died, and a lot of people will become homeless. So that's what we have to concern with. And therefore, I tend to view the term imperialism in this context, because it's more realistic, more urgent to our survival situation. So that's how I look at it. In terms of Macron's words, I tend to view him as as in a position that he wants to lead the whole European Union as opposed to Germany, right? Because the 2 countries had some issues with each other from time to time. But for Macron, he certainly in that ambition to do something. So I think that nowadays we can see the whole world is divided in 2 camps. One is democracy, the other one is authoritarian. And it goes without saying that it's hard to find ambiguity, or it's hard to find a gray area between the 2 camps. We have to decide, which camp we join, and that's the value. Absolute to me, it's not relative. That we have to decide. We have to determine.
Okay, Yen Chen-shen, Albert had mentioned about Taiwan's situation with the threats from China. Could we say that Xi Jinping also is imperialistic?
Okay, first of all, I think even if you look at the Macron talk. And Scholz talk, no mentioning of Taiwan at all. No mentioning of, when he mentioned China, Macron is talking about U.S.-China relation being a tension, and then asking China more to cooperate on the climate change area. So no mention of this. But if we want to, kind of imply that maybe, China is doing similar things to Russia, but I think in a way they both are saying this is not imperialism. This is more like irredentism, mean more like I want to recover the territory I lost, right? Okay, so at the time in 2014, you find Crimea saying, well, Crimea was only given to Ukraine in 1950s. So it is not traditionally part of Ukraine, but Russia was like celebrating its union with Ukraine by giving them a gift. And now, I mean, since you no longer are part of us and you no longer are our friend anymore because you want to join NATO, you want to join European Union, so we took it back. But that started, this slippery slope.
Yeah, because now we have Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk.
Yeah, and all the eastern part. But still, Russia would say, we are rescuing our Russian national because they have been suffering a cultural genocide. The language, the culture being, compromised. So the same thing I think for China will eventually use is, Taiwan should be returned to China, even though in Taiwan we do not necessarily, a lot of people do not necessarily consider a historical tie with China. But the reality is, even the Qing dynasty made Taiwan a province only for 10 years before it was, ceded to Japan in 1895. But during that, before that time, from, Ming Dynasty, Zheng Chenggong, you do have Qing Dynasty ruling over Taiwan, but not assigning Taiwan the status. We can argue in Taiwan, like when Li Hongzhang ceded Taiwan to Japan, saying Taiwan is a place where, the bird won't sing, the flowers are not blossoming.
Professor, we will discuss this a little bit later in the show, so let's have that discussion then. To discuss why we should be concerned about return to the age of imperialism, I spoke to Mathieu Droin, a visiting fellow at CSIS's Europe, Russia and Eurasia Program, focusing on transatlantic security and defense. He spoke to me from Washington.
When you look at the rationale behind the invasion of Ukraine, it actually dates back from very ancient history of Russia, dating back to the what they call the Rus of Kiev. So basically, it's more what we call a revisionist vision of history that not only applies to Soviet Union, but an idea that Russia must have a significant role on the world stage.
Why should the world be worried about the rise of imperialism?
The international order, the international architecture that was put in place after World War II, of course, it has been far from perfect. It did not prevent wars from happening. It did not prevent great power competitions, but at least it provided a framework for dialogue, for cooperation with values, principles, rules that everyone agreed to respect and to protect. And now what we're seeing is that this architecture is de facto crumbling because of the rise of unilateralism, because of the development of alternative models and attempts to change the rules to favor these agendas of what Macron called contemporary imperialism in his speech at the United Nations General Assembly.
And why do you think we are seeing the age of imperialism returning?
If you look at how Russia presents the 19th century as the century of humiliation, how Putin, as we already said, mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union as the main catastrophe. And that goes along with the feeling that the West is in decline based on the failure of some military operations in the Middle East or in Africa, the economic difficulties resulting from the 2008 financial crisis, or even internal divisions such as Brexit. And so all in all, these countries are convinced that the West is in decline, and this is also why they're being more assertive. And it will be, of course, interesting to see how these events are factored in by China for the future. But all in all, it means that the world is a less safer place because of this return of imperialism, and that was the main message of the French President Emmanuel Macron in his speech at the United Nations General Assembly.
What do you think democracies can do to counter the rise of imperialism?
Well, they are actually doing a lot already, but obviously they have to step up. I mean, there are the kind of let's call them punitive measures that we are seeing now as a response to the Russia invasion of Ukraine. But there are also some long-term measures to try to defend the values and principles that are enshrined in democratic system. Democracies, if they want their survival on the long term, must also be able to make democracy attractive again. And this is a major line of effort.
That was Mathieu Droin, a visiting fellow at CSIS, speaking to me from Washington. Yen Chen-shen, I want to pick up on a few things that Droin mentioned in relation to Russia and see whether we can apply them to China. So he mentioned this revisionist history and also saying that the post-war order is under threat because of the rise of unilateralism, you know, this development of alternative models and attempts to change the rules to their favor. China says that Taiwan has always been part of China. So is this true, or is this revisionist history?
Okay, I think, you know, from China's perspective, they always, if you look at the three, the Taiwan policy paper, white papers, they will always have a paragraph on the historical ties. No matter whether you agree with it or not, but Taiwan's history does have some connection with China, right? Most of the people in Taiwan originated from southeast part of China.
But there are also other peoples.
Yeah, there are also other people,
Taiwan.
but if you want to look at the majority, the Han people, right? That's the majority. That's mostly, you know, in the past few hundred years, coming from mainland China to Taiwan. So that, I think we cannot deny that. But, you know, everywhere you find, in a while, they would develop a new type of identity. So that's what happened in Taiwan right now. But from China's perspective, I think the younger generation, they will feel that Taiwan, this also younger Taiwanese, do not identify with China. So it is easier for them to resort to the use of force or support this kind of nationalism from the government. But if you look at the older generation, they felt, you know, Taiwan, especially our democracy, actually is something that they crave for because they grew up in the 1970s and especially 1980, when China had a period of opening, you know, we call Beijing Spring, and they experienced a period of opening and, you know, an aspiration for democracy, which later was totally changed. So they felt that if Taiwan is there and there's a unification process, that in order for China to become democratized, or in order for China to unify Taiwan peacefully or persuading Taiwan to join China, they have to do something to democratize because the two systems are different. So they actually pack their hope on us. But the younger generation, totally different. So I think that's why we are on a collision course, because the generation of having affinity with Taiwan, really like Taiwan.
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused about whether you're talking about China or Taiwan. Has there been a mix there in what you're saying? When you said that the younger generation would support use of force, you were talking about
in China.
Okay. And right now you're saying about the democratization.
Yeah. The older generation in China went through the 1980s. They like democracy, they like openness, so they felt that if Taiwan is part of the unification project, maybe Beijing authority, Xi Jinping, they have to somehow opening up in order to attract Taiwan. So that's why they still pinch their hope on Taiwan. But the younger generation is so nationalist. They don't care. They feel their authoritarian way is okay. They felt they found an alternative model of development. So I think they are more supportive of China using military force.
Albert Cho, if I could return to the question, revisionist history, is that what China is using about its claims on Taiwan?
Well, actually, if you say Taiwan is a part of China, we think about culture backgrounds or even the ethnicity connection, I would say yes. But when it comes to the lifestyle and also the belief in democracy and human rights, in the freedom of speech, we are two different countries for sure. And again, I don't see any distinction between the two arguments. Taiwan is part of China, Taiwan is not part of China. Because we think about a case versus, regarding British and United States, right? I mean, the U.S. independence from UK was not something to say that it was not part of it. I mean, it was, but was not, later on. So I don't see any problem with that. But also, I do want to emphasize that the identity thing. Because the two political entities in Taiwan and also in China has been separated out from each other for so long. And we have subscribed different types of values, democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech, and even the party organization from the Western society for so long in Taiwan. And as time goes by, our younger generation, just as Professor Yen Chen-shen just mentioned, we are getting used to a new, different paradigm. And the paradigm is by no means perfect. It has its own problems, just like what the figure in the footage just saying, that in a democracy, problems include like mediocre national leaders, inefficient governance, and even populism. But even with that, right, we are still seeing one good big advantage of democracy is that we are good at self-reflection. We are open to any kind of criticism and change, just like what we do now in the show.
And also dialogue.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to unilateral attempts. Yen Chen-shen, do you agree with what Albert Cho said? And can I also ask you about this century of humiliation, which Droin just mentioned? So Russia also has a century, the 19th century, and how far, we know that for Xi Jinping, the great rejuvenation starts from that century of humiliation, and this is what the Chinese dream, he says, is all about. Can we talk about what this means for Taiwan?
Well, sometimes, when I study European history, and then I ask myself, if today I go to Portugal or Spain or even Turkey, are they reminiscing about their good old days of the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire, or the Portuguese, who is the first imperialist in a way, colonial power, and then Spain, right? This whole Latin America there, and now you're confined to this. And then also look at our friend Lithuania, back in the Middle Age, right? It was an empire. It was a big.
So you believe that they were happier before?
No. I'm just saying every country will write revisionist history. Every time, if they are in power, they want to justify their rule. They want to justify certain action. It's revisionist. Okay. So look at America right now. They are rewriting their history to have more we call multicultural background. And so originally, when I study or teaching American history in the U.S., the first textbook is about Great Britain and then U.S., right? And then later people say, no, you cannot do that. You have to teach about Africa, because those 1/3 of this American history is from the slaves. And so you have to talk about Africa. And then, no, not enough. You have to talk about Native American, the Indian. So everybody is doing revisionist. I think, one day when, the conservative came back to power, they might introduce alternative textbook as well, talking about different things.
Albert Cho. So Droin also says that democracies must make democracy attractive again. And the West believed that this was possible in China 10 to 15 years ago. Do you think they've given up hope of this happening?
Well, I used to, think there's a possibility of democracy in China as much as what Professor Yen just brought about like 10 years ago when I was, still younger in my 20s. But originally, I had hope in Xi Jinping's governance in the very beginning stage. But gradually, I find that kind of possibility fade away. You see the tighten up grasp on the media in domestic China, and also resist to any kind of dialogue with the Western national leaders on the side of China. I see that kind of possibility is decreasing. And what Professor Yen mentioned early on, I think was a good point, is that if there is ever a possibility of a unification of China and Taiwan, only one way out for Taiwanese people is that there's a democracy in China. And a democracy doesn't need to be resembled to that of the United States or that of Germany. As long as it's democracy, it's open to dialogue, open to criticism, open to any kind of supervision from the civil society. That's fine by us. And we can take one step further to talk about that possibility. But unfortunately, I don't see that's likely, not within the next 100 years or even 200 years, as long as the CCP is still in power. So it's hard. And we see that even though Taiwanese and Chinese belong to the same ethnicity category, but the brain structure, the cultural composition, the whole ideology diverged so bad, so far away from each other, that I don't see any hope that this is likely, the unification. Not to and also the reason for that is that the democracy is totally impossible in China. It's hard for us to swallow that if we want to become one country and to subscribe to that kind of top-down draconian governance. So I don't see that's likely.
Yeah, I might want to add Professor Chu's points on this. If China become more democratic, you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, maybe Taiwan will be willing to have some kind of dialogue and also possibility of unification. But at the same time, if China become democratized and then Taiwan decide not to join them, they will say, hey, that's your choice. They will respect our will, right? If China is a democratic state, but this is not going to happen. I think during the Hu Jintao period, we have probably greater hope at that time. Even the West, the whole West is considering there's a possibility of we call peaceful evolution through engagement, but not anymore. I think. But one thing, the research fellow you interview gave a great point, is that democracy has to show its resiliency by having greater good governance. But if, look at the United States domestically, there are so much violence and other stuff. It's easy for become criticism for China about Western democracy, that you almost have anarchy in certain places.
Okay, thank you. Now, before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine's territory, he argued that the country was part of historical Russian lands and should be reunified with Russia to make a spiritual whole. This echoes the language used by Xi Jinping and CCP spokespeople about Taiwan. Oleksandr Merezhko, Ukrainian member of parliament and chair of the Ukraine-Taiwan Friendship Group within Ukraine's Rada, told me why he thinks Ukraine and Taiwan should support each other.
If Ukraine fails, if Ukraine falls because of Russian aggression, it creates huge security problem because it sets very dangerous precedent for other dictatorial regimes, and it creates temptation to invade Taiwan. That's why it is in our common interest to strengthen Ukraine, to improve security of Ukraine, and to strengthen security of Taiwan.
You have also joined IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and there was a annual meeting that was held in the US. AIPAC has grown as an international force. What role do you think it has to play globally?
In my opinion, AIPAC is a coalition of like-minded members of parliament, like-minded people who understand that now China, authoritarian regime in China, to be more correct, presents a danger, a threat to democracy, to global democracy, to human rights, to a rules-based order. And we need together to create a common policy towards China. It's extremely important. And we should have solidarity in face of the threats coming from authoritarian regimes all over the world. The more members of AIPAC will be in national parliaments, the better for the creation of such common strategy, how to counter authoritarian regimes and their attempts to undermine global democracy and global security.
Moving back to Ukraine, can you tell us about the strategy now to reclaim Crimea? This seems to be a different strategy from the start of the war. Why has there been this change now?
I would like to remind that Russian invasion and Russian occupation of our territories in Ukraine had started from Crimea. And the strategy before was to make this burden for Russia unbearable by using sanctions, by using isolation of Russia as an aggressor state. But now, because of the new full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine, this strategy, it seems to me, has changed, because now we have intention to liberate completely the whole territory of Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea. We are using also military means to bring Crimea back, because it's part of our territory, integral part of our territory.
What do you say to the people who talk about coming up with a diplomatic solution which will help to save lives, but may involve giving up some territory?
It's impossible. I would say to these people, just imagine that it is not Ukraine, but your own country is under attack. And you are offered compromise at the expense of your territory and your people, who will be just in slavery under Russian occupation, under foreign occupation. Of course, it's totally unacceptable to us. And the issue also in international law, we're trying to follow the rules and principles of international law, specifically such principles as territorial integrity and sovereign equality of states. So we are not only restoring our territorial integrity of Ukraine, but also by bringing back our territories, by deoccupying them, we are restoring international legal order and international security all over the world.
We have heard about the impacts of the invasion of Ukraine in terms of energy crisis, food prices, inflation. I wanted to ask you, what is the situation in Ukraine itself? Do you have enough energy? Do you have enough food?
At present moment, it's very difficult for us because we have to go through winter. And the truth is that Russia has already destroyed almost half of our GDP and our economy. Russia deliberately is targeting our infrastructure, civilian objects, including power stations, because Russia wants to destroy us not only militarily, but also economically. And of course, it is very hard. I can give you an example that monthly a deficit of our budget amounts to $5 billion US. You can imagine how difficult it is for us. But our government, our president, and our parliament, to which I belong, we're doing everything we can to go through this winter and to survive economically. I'm sure that we succeed in this, but again, with the help of our partners and our allies. And I hope Taiwan can also be helpful in our attempts to survive. And Taiwan has already started to provide us with the necessary aid, for example, to our capital, to Kyiv, where I live. And it's very important for us, and we really appreciate your help and your support.
It's been more than half a year into this long war. Your soldiers must be fatigued. What is it that is driving them on?
Highly motivated to defend our motherland for a very simple reason. We are fighting for our families and for our homes. We know that we're in grave danger because Russia is committing genocide of Ukrainian nation. And we know what to expect from Russia in case if we fail. We have seen these examples in Bucha, in Irpin, now in Izum. So we don't want to live under occupation and we don't want to be exterminated by Russia. That's why we have no other option but to continue our fighting. And we'll be fighting as long as it is necessary. We have no choice. And I'm sure that we will win. It's just a matter of time.
Do you have any tips, any lessons for Taiwan, which could face the same fate as Ukraine?
My recommendation or my suggestion to Taiwan or to any country which lives under threat of external aggression is, first of all, to be prepared militarily, to have enough weapons to defend itself. This is the first point. Second, population of the country should be ready to fight, and should be highly motivated to fight for your motherland. And finally, we need broad international solidarity in support of the potential victim of foreign aggression. We need all kinds of support, supporting international organizations, support from particular countries, economic, political support, and also information support, which is also important because we are waging information war. And we need to win victories in not only on battlefields, but also in the sphere of information.
That was Ukraine-Taiwan Friendship Group Chair Oleksandr Merezhko speaking to me earlier. Albert Cho, so Merezhko talks about Ukraine's failed use of diplomacy after Crimea was annexed in 2014. If back then they had thought of Putin as having imperialistic ambitions, would things have ended up differently?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if Ukraine as well as Western countries like United States or France or Germany, they would have had a different idea about the possibility of the attack from Russia in Ukraine, things would have been different, of course. And so, but it's still not too late for us to realize that, you know, the ambition of those, you know, dictators like Putin or even Xi Jinping or even Kim in North Korea. Still now we can do something to repair that. Is such that we should, you know, hand in hand and work together to get something ready. And like what he suggested, you know, the best implication for Taiwan is that the military preparation. I do, though, want to emphasize is that the military preparation is the best way to avoid war. That does not mean that we seek, you know, to fight with China or Ukraine to seek fight with Russia, but quite the opposite. You know, that's one thing. The best way to avoid war is to get prepared. Number two is that we have to realize that the nature of Communist Party is cheating, is camouflage in its shape in order to get more benefits. And history has been teaching us over and over again about that kind of scenarios, and we have to learn that. And dialogue are really based on the national capabilities. Dialogue in international society does not based on sincerity, and that's what we have to learn in Taiwan when we talk to China. And the last thing we should do is that kind of naive thinking that, you know, whatever they said, we have to take it, we have to believe it, and otherwise, you know, probably we will tend to dismiss or underestimate the possibility of Chinese attacking Taiwan in the future. So that's what I learned from his footage, from his interviews. Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Well, you know, I agree for what he said about being prepared, being ready to fight. But at the same time, I think, you know, since Ukraine, right, we have seen almost a cottage industry of comparing Taiwan with Ukraine. You know, from all the major magazines, from all the news work, and from the think tank pieces, but very few people about talking about how to avoid war. I think there is still possibility of avoiding war. And I felt that Taiwan, if the leaders are innovative enough, can find out something that try to talk to China and then make the international community say, wow, Taiwan is actually changing the ball game by forcing China not to use force against Taiwan. What I'm meaning is, if we offer some kind of plan to talk to China, but we have our own insistence on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and we gave China a few decades to improve that, saying, before that, we will not declare independence, so China has no reason to attack us because we will not do that. But at the same time, we gave you conditions of what, if you want to have unification with us, this is what we want to have, maintain our lifestyle. Mm-hmm.
Albert Shaw, I understand that we are open to dialogue. Sorry, the Taiwanese government is open to dialogue on equal terms.
It's hard though, because think about the stubbornness or the rigidity of the ideology in China, especially if we observe closely President Xi Jinping, what he said, what he does, and in certain type of holidays in China, for example, they are against United States together with North Korea, that kind of festival, the language they use, that's, we conventionally regarded as a warrior diplomacy, right? Mm. And recently, I even watched a show where there's a little kid from TikTok talk about, his ambition in the future is to become a governor of Taiwan, and he will clean up, the wrong ideologies in Taiwan. He will clean up, the wrong people in Taiwan. Mm. So to me, that's the side effect of this long-term brainwash in China, and it's irreversible. It's hard to come back.
And Albert. The lesson, I guess, that Merezhko was talking about was that he was saying that diplomacy didn't work. That's what they tried with Crimea. And now they're resorting to the military as the only last resort. So I don't know whether, Yen Chen-shen, you want to comment on that, because what you're saying is Taiwan should use diplomacy.
But at least, there's one thing different between Taiwan and Ukraine, there's two scenarios. We are not adjacent to China. We have a strait. We can ask for something, and then we can ask China to change itself. Whether China agree with us, but it is not our problem of China continue to accuse us of being separatist, being seeking independence.
So if we ask them to change,
we ask them to change. I said we give you 30 years.
Okay. And then?
Then if you don't, then we will declare independence. But I give you 30 years. So at least our generation here do not have to be accused of this. And China.
And do you think that the communists would listen to that?
Well,
so after 30 years and we declare independence, will there be war?
No, we look at China after 30 years. We said, maybe you have improved somewhat. I'll give you another 20 years too. But this, I think China, I talked to Chinese people. They felt that if we force their government, they would like to see some of the benefits of more freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They agree with this type of idea. But I know, people say, oh, Xi Jinping won't care about this. No, he will care, because the only justification for China to use force against Taiwan is Taiwan being separatist, being, trying to become independent, trying to leave China. But we said we are not leaving until you change yourself. But we gave you
Albert Cho, do you think, is that actually the situation?
Well, I actually want to add up, that the difficulty in this kind of plan is that the internal structure of the Communist Party is that the vested interests resist to that type of idea, because any change in that, any transition to democracy would decrease their benefits. This is pretty much what we have seen in the Putin's leadership group, right? Where you have those rich person and also military person that protective of the leadership of Putin, because they enjoy something from that. They are vested interests. So by the same token, we see the same structure in the Chinese society. I mean, the Chinese leadership in Donghai, in their
because
in
it's
the
totalitarian.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's hard if we don't remove the CCP first, and we talk about that.
So maybe the people have to come up and have
Yeah,
a people's
that's what I'm saying.
revolution.
So I sort of agree.
Once that's done, then
yeah.
they can democratize.
Right, I sort of agree with Professor Yen's idea, but it has to be very strategic, very, also we need some kind of coincidence in history, like, in 1991 when Russia went into collapse just overnight. So it's not easy, and the only thing we can do right now is just get prepared. And Taiwan is not a powerful country. We're such a small island. The only thing we can do is make ourselves very tough to get over with. If you dare to touch us, then you might be in trouble, and I might bite you, I might make you pain. And that's the only thing we can do, because we have to look up to the United States, look up to Japan, even look up to Russia. I mean, look up to Ukraine and also other European countries to help us out. But let's have the best hope for that. I think in the long run, history will be with us, because it's really hard as a political science professor to think about the possibility that people will live in that kind of condition. It doesn't matter whether Chinese government make it work or not, but it's only in the past 60 years. It's not like in 600 years. But think about democracy. It's much longer, right? So that's how I view it.
Yen Chen-shen, I'm interested about your idea of giving sort of terms to
we should
the
have
Chinese.
offensive, not being defensive only.
So your terms to them, you say maybe giving them 20 years, 30 years, but in the meantime, they could invade Taiwan, right? I mean, Xi Jinping wants to do that.
Within the 20 years, we're not going to declare independence. We are not.
So you are saying that if Taiwan doesn't declare independence, then Taiwan is safe, that there will be no invasion?
We would say we are not seeking independence at this time.
I believe that the Taiwanese government has already done that. Is that not correct, Albert Cho?
That was KMT's version of the plan. I think that even the DPP, President Tsai Ing-wen really does not have a room to declare independence right away.
Yeah.
So, it's about election, right? Basically, the distinction between the two major parties, and maybe even TPP, led by Cohen's, would do the same thing. Whoever is in that position, even when President Chen Shui-bian was in office, he said the same thing. So we are already doing that. So the ball is not in our hand. The situation we cannot really control of. I mean, what's really changed is from China.
If DPP right now with President Tsai continue to claim they are maintaining the status quo, right? And they know that by declaring independence, the United States might not come to our assistance. So if this is the real reality now, why don't you put it in action? Saying, it's not possible to have independence right now. So why don't we pretend, or at least use unification as a tool to gain our security that way, saying 30 years or something. That will, and every year we want to review China's improvement on freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly.
But perhaps it's because there is no desire.